So one of the key advertising decisions really needs to be, what media vehicles will I use to deliver my message? Remember that the goal in developing an advertising program and selecting the right media is to maximize the exposures to my target audience and minimize the cost. So I really need to identify the best way to reach my audience with my message for the least amount of money. There are lots of different potential of advertising media. Your book discusses many of them. Your book discusses television, radio, magazines, newspapers, etc. And it gives you the advantages and disadvantages. And you ought to be familiar with these because each medium has advantages, but each medium also has disadvantages. So you ought to be familiar with those because I'm sure that some of those questions will come up on the exam. Here's a little chart showing the advertising spending medium in the United States in 2016 by medium type. And so in terms of the total, the two largest spends right now in the United States are, in terms of medium, are television, followed by internet and digital, followed by radio and newspapers at about the same amount, magazines a little bit lower, and then outdoor advertising, which includes things like bus wraps and billboards, is obviously at the bottom of this list. So which one should we use? Well, once again, depends on the target audience. All right. So how do I select this medium? Well, first it has to reach my target audience. There's no reason for me to advertise in a place where my target audience won't see things, no matter how good the deal. It's not enough that the ad reaches many people. It has to reach our target audience. And the way to reach different audience, of course, varies significantly depending on what the audience is. Even younger millennials are different, have to be reached differently than older millennials. So the media selection, some of the things your book talked about in terms of evaluating different mediums. They talked about some terminology that's important for you to know about, and I'm sure is going to come up on the exam. First is reach. And the reach is the average number of households that saw the advertisement once. Frequency is the average number of times an individual or a household is exposed to the advertisement. All right. And so to get gross rating points, it's reach times frequency. So gross rating points, for instance, so calculating gross rating points would be like this. If I reach 30% of my target audience with 4 responses, that's 120 gross rating points. On the other hand, if I reach 40% of my audience with 3 exposures, I also get 120 gross rating points. If I reach 20% of my audience with 6 exposures, once again, I'm at 120 gross rating points. Those are all different gross rating points, and they're all the same amount of gross rating points, but you get there in different ways. In some instances, it's important to try to maximize reach. One of the ways you'll see companies maximizing reach is they'll take, during the same time on television, for instance, during the 11 o'clock news, they'll advertise on all of the different TV stations that are broadcasting the news. That way they know they've hit a wide range of households. They've maximized their reach. On the other hand, I could focus on one network and run 3 or 4 ads in a row on one network, in which case I would get a lot more frequency, but not as much reach. All right, and so some cases I need reach. That is, if I just need to do reminder ads, I'm typically interested in reach. When I'm worried about persuasion and informing people, I tend to need more frequency. All right, and so we see how gross rating points are then calculated. One of the important aspects of media selection is the idea of impact. That is the quality of those exposures. So for instance, we could have a billboard at the airport, and every day when you go to school, if you come through the airport tunnel, you go past those billboards. Do you know what's on those billboards? In many cases, the answer is no. Now, every time you drive by one of those billboards, it's an exposure. But in many cases, the traffic is heavy, and you're paying attention to your driving, and you're not looking at the billboards. Those are low-quality impacts and low-quality exposures. So 2 things about the quality of the exposures. One, is it the right target audience? And secondly, do you actually see or listen to the ad? Another term that is used very often for media selection is the idea of cost per thousand exposures. And then also the cost per impression and cost per click. Now, cost per click is one of the things that we do in terms of buying AdWords or if we are in fact doing internet-based search engine marketing. We worried about pay per clicks. This is the cost per click through. And so many cases, every time someone clicks through on one of the ads at the top of the Google thing, that company then has to pay Google a certain amount of money. It might be 5 or 6 cents, but of course those all add up. Cost per impression is the actual individual cost per impression. Now, cost per thousand of exposures is something that is talked about a lot. So let me just show you that calculation. Cost per thousand impressions is calculated by determining the cost of the ad divided by the audience size times 1,000. So if the ad costs, $3,338,000 and the audience was 3 million people, then the cost per thousand is $113 per thousand exposures. And so you can see how this calculation is made. It's important to do this because that gives us a feeling of trying to compare different sources of or different ways to reach audiences in a way that allows us to be a little bit more consistent in terms of how we're making that evaluation. Now, how do you evaluate whether or not the message was successful? Well, typically we do this with the before and after test. Typically, so some of the typical advertising evaluations are recall and recognition. Okay, recall is the stronger of the evaluation measures. I could have unaided recall, so I could ask you, tell me which advertisements you saw on the Super Bowl, and then you could start telling me which advertisements you saw. That's called unaided recall. I could ask you, but turn around then and ask you, well, what soft drink ads did you see on the Super Bowl? Well, as soon as I start to funnel that down into something much more specific, that's called aided recall. And then, of course, the weakest version of this is called recognition, where I give you a list of ads or a list of companies and say, do you remember any of these people advertising on the Super Bowl? And you simply check all of those that you recognize. Unaided recall is crucial for products where the individual has to do some searching. On the other hand, recognition is fine if, in fact, decisions are being made at the point of purchase, and all I have to do is go to the store, look on the shelf, and recognize the brand that I was looking for. All right, but these could also be measured in terms of knowledge or attitude change, etc. And your book talks a little bit about those different ways to make these same kinds of measures.